Welcome to the Darkling Radio, a channel where every story drags you deeper into the unknown. Here, shadows whisper, fear takes form, and horror comes alive in immersive first-person tales you'll never forget. Caleb Mercer and Reinhold were assigned to Ravenford Station expecting nothing more than cold nights, routine duty, and the weight of silence in the wilderness. But soon, the silence began to move, the shadows began to breathe, and they discovered the outpost wasn't guarding the forest, something inside the forest was guarding them. The deployment order felt like punishment. I had been sent to an isolated outpost tucked in the folds of the mountains, a forgotten place where the air was thin and the silence pressed down like a weight. The base was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten barracks, a half-buried bunker, and a rusting radio tower that looked like it hadn't worked in years. There was no city nearby, no village within reach, just miles of wilderness stretching into darkness. The only road in or out was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound through the cliffs like a scar. Beyond that was nothing but forest, so dense it seemed to swallow light. The isolation hit me first. There was no hum of traffic, no chatter, no distant machinery, only wind that moaned through the trees, carrying with it a strange hollow sound that sometimes felt like a voice. The others shrugged it off as nature, but I couldn't ignore the sensation that the land itself was alive, breathing slowly around us. I often caught myself listening too closely, trying to catch words hidden in the breeze, only to shake my head and laugh at my own nerves. Days bled into one another, slow and uneventful. We patrolled the perimeter, checked supply counts, and reported back with nothing to say. The outpost's purpose was unclear, as if we were guarding relics that no one cared about anymore. The radio tower's rusted frame clicked in the wind, cables swaying like loose nooses. The bunker sat silent, a gaping mouth in the hillside that breathed damp, stale air whenever we opened its heavy doors. Orders were simple: hold the ground, maintain the watch, wait. So that's what we did, though none of us ever understood why. At night, the silence grew heavier, broken only by faint scratching from the forest. I told myself it was branches shifting against each other, maybe small animals scurrying in the brush, but the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate. It came in short bursts, stopped, and then started again as if waiting for me to notice. Lying awake in my bunk, I could feel the scratching creeping closer, inching toward the thin walls of the barracks. I buried my head in the pillow, trying to block it out, but the noise drilled its way into my skull until sleep felt impossible. The floodlights around the base were our only comfort. They kept the clearing bright, a pale circle that pushed the forest back just enough. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something waited beyond their glow. On my late-night shifts, I scanned the tree line, and sometimes my eyes played tricks on me. I thought I saw shapes standing between the trunk stool, thin outlines that blurred when I tried to focus. Each time I blinked, they melted into the shadows, leaving me unsure if I had seen anything at all. I convinced myself it was exhaustion. That's what I wanted to believe. But one night while I stood watch, something happened that I couldn't explain away. The floodlights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The clearing was swallowed in instant darkness so complete that my own hands vanished from view. In that short, suffocating moment, I felt the weight of eyes on me. My skin prickled, my heart pounded in my chest, and then I saw them. Figures at the edge of the clearing, dozens of them, lined up at the tree line. They didn't move, they didn't even sway with the wind. They just stood there, blacker than the dark around them. Before I could breathe, the lights flared back to life. The clearing was empty again, the trees still and silent. My pulse thundered in my ears as I forced myself to scan every inch of the perimeter, but there was nothing, only the same endless trees watching me. For the rest of the night, I stood frozen, afraid to blink in case the dark swallowed me again. The next morning, when the sun finally rose and painted the clearing in pale light, I tried to dismiss it all as imagination. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me in the blackout. Maybe my exhaustion had created ghosts out of shadows. That was what I told myself until I saw what we found near the fence. The dirt around the perimeter was churned with deep prints, circling the entire base. They weren't boots. They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot, human, pressed so clearly into the mud that I could make out each toe. There weren't just one or two. There were dozens, maybe more. And they hadn't been there the day before. It looked like something had gathered around us in the night, pacing in the dark, watching as we slept. After the discovery of the footprints, everything about the outpost changed. We tried to carry on as usual, but the air was heavier, thick with unease. None of us wanted to say it aloud, but we all knew that we hadn't been alone that night. Those prints had circled us like wolves closing in on prey. Each step was deliberate. Each mark pressed deep into the mud, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a long time, staring inward at the base. The others began walking faster on patrol, eyes darting toward the tree line with every crack of a branch. Meals were eaten in silence, the sound of spoons clinking against metal trays almost unbearable in the heavy quiet. At night, I sat on my bunk staring at the ceiling, waiting for the scratching to return. When it did, I didn't even flinch anymore. The sound wasn't distant now. It scraped right against the walls, as if something was circling the barracks itself. The trees seemed different in the daylight, too. They were too close, leaning in toward the fences as though they wanted to listen. The branches twisted strangely, bending toward the floodlights like skeletal fingers reaching for warmth. On patrol, when I raised my scope and stared into the woods, I thought I saw faces among the bark and shadows, pale, stretched faces that stared back at me, motionless. They vanished when I lowered the scope, and for a moment I wondered if my mind was starting to fracture. But the unease I felt was too real, the instinct too strong. Something was watching us. The bunker became the one place I avoided unless necessary. I told myself it was because of the damp, the smell of rust and mold that seeped out of its doors, but the truth was deeper. There was something wrong with the walls down there. They seemed to sweat, beads of water trailing down the concrete as though the bunker itself was alive. On one of my checks I found the storage room door open. Inside, the dim bulbs cast long shadows over the shelves of supplies. That was when I saw them, handprints smeared across the wall. They were dark, almost black, not painted but burned into the surface like char, and they were small, too small to belong to anyone at the outpost. I touched one with my glove and pulled back instantly, the concrete oddly warm beneath my fingers. I tried to push the image out of my mind, but later that night the alarms screamed through the base. The sensors that ringed the perimeter had been tripped on every side. We scrambled outside with our rifles, hearts pounding, expecting to see intruders rushing the fence. Instead, we found only silence and shadows. The forest stood still, too still. Not even the wind moved through the branches. I scanned the clearing under the harsh glow of the floodlights, my pulse racing. Every angle was empty. But something felt wrong with the shadows themselves. They stretched unnaturally long across the dirt, as though the lights were shining from an angle that didn't exist. Some shadows seemed to twitch, like they were trying to move on their own. I blinked and they were still again, lying flat like normal. The others shifted uneasily, but no one said a word. When the alarms abruptly stopped, the silence was even worse. I looked down at my boots, trying to ground myself, and froze. Fresh mud clung thick to the soles. My patrol had been confined to the platform all night, and the ground there was dry. My stomach twisted as I realized the mud wasn't mine. My boots were clean before the alarm. I hadn't stepped off the platform, but someone had. I tried to scrape the mud away, but it stuck, dark and wet, as though it had just been pulled from the ground. That night I didn't dare remove my boots. I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at the floor, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes. I knew if I did, I'd dream of shadows stretching long into the trees and the sound of bare feet circling in the mud, waiting for the lights to flicker again. Sleep became a luxury none of us could afford. I lay in my bunk at night, staring into the dark, unable to close my eyes for more than a few seconds without seeing them. Pale shapes between the trees, their faces blank, their mouths stretched wide, their bodies to still. I could feel them watching me even when I buried my head beneath my blanket. My body trembled with exhaustion, but fear was stronger than fatigue. Every creak of the barracks made me jolt upright, certain that something was moving through the halls. During the day, the forest seemed to mock us. I noticed details that hadn't been there before. The path we had always taken to collect supply drops was gone, swallowed by trees that seemed to appear overnight. Where there had once been a clear trail of dirt and gravel, now there was nothing but a wall of trunks pressed tight together. The land itself was shifting, changing its shape when no one was looking. On patrol, I realized the cliff we sometimes climbed for a view of the valley had changed. The rocks were jagged and uneven, sharper than I remembered, as if the mountain had grown teeth. The others were restless, though none of us spoke of it directly. Our patrols grew shorter, and no one wanted to check the bunker alone. I tried to steady myself, to follow procedure, but each step outside the barracks felt heavier. The silence in the forest was unnatural. No birds, no insects, no movement of branches. It was as if the world beyond our fences had been drained of life, leaving only the trees to stand as silent witnesses. That night, while inspecting the fence line, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood outside the perimeter, just beyond the reach of the lights. It looked like one of my fellow soldiers. His back turned to me. He stood motionless, shoulders stiff, staring into the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, wondering why he was outside the gates at this hour. My instinct was to call out, but the sound died in my chest. Something about the stillness of his posture felt wrong. I blinked and he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I rushed back inside, heart hammering, and checked the barracks. Every bed was filled, including his. He lay sleeping, pale and sweating, his chest rising and falling heavily. My skin crawled as I stared down at him, remembering the figure at the fence that looked exactly like him. I wanted to wake him, to shake him, but something held me back. If I touched him, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Later I checked again, hoping I had imagined it, but this time there wasn't just one. Outside, standing at the tree line, were three of them. Their silhouettes were tall, their limbs unnaturally long. They looked like us from a distance, but their proportions were distorted, too thin, too stretched, as if someone had tried to copy the human form but had gotten the details wrong. They didn't move. They only stood in silence, watching, waiting. By dawn, the ground told the truth. The footprints had returned, more of them than before. They weren't scattered loosely around the base anymore. They circled tighter, spiraling inward, pressing deeper into the mud, as though whatever left them had been standing in place, staring up at our windows. When I leaned closer, I saw that some of the prints were smeared, dragged unnaturally, like the feet had been pulled along the ground instead of walking. I couldn't shake the thought that the forest wasn't just surrounding us anymore. It was closing in, reshaping itself, twisting into something unfamiliar. And the figures that watched us weren't simply outside the base, they were already inside our minds, wearing our shapes, waiting for the moment when the lights would fail again. The bunker became the only place we thought might protect us, though stepping inside it felt more like a descent into a grave. The forest pressed tighter each night, and the shapes at the tree line were appearing too often, too close. We locked the gates, reinforced the fences, and retreated underground, telling ourselves that thick walls of concrete would keep us safe. But safety was an illusion. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the earth was swallowing us whole. The air in the bunker was colder than outside, damp enough to cling to my skin. Every breath echoed faintly, as though the holes were listening. The fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzed in protest, their light too weak to chase the shadows from the corners. I followed the long, narrow corridors, and it didn't take long before the silence turned hostile. I noticed the walls were covered in faint etchings, carved lines that wound into spirals and jagged shapes. They seemed harmless at first, like old graffiti, but the longer I stared, the more they seemed to move. The spirals bent inward, twisting, until I felt dizzy, as if they were pulling me through the concrete itself. I pressed on, forcing myself to inspect the storage rooms. The smell hit me before I even stepped inside, rot thick and sour. When I raised my flashlight, the beam caught rows of shelves stacked with boxes and gear. Everything should have been ordinary, yet my eyes locked on something else. Against the far wall, hanging neatly, were military uniforms, dozens of them. They were perfectly arranged, sleeves resting at their sides, heads bowed slightly forward as if standing at attention. But the room was supposed to be for food rations, not clothing. I stepped closer and noticed how each uniform bulged at the chest and legs, filled as if someone was inside. My stomach churned as I reached out to touch one. The instant my fingers brushed the fabric, it collapsed into itself. There was nothing inside, just limp cloth falling to the floor. I stumbled back, light shaking in my hand, and in that moment every uniform turned. Not their bodies, not a shift of fabric, but the heads all at once, snapping toward me as though something unseen had commanded it. Their empty collars gaped like mouths. My breath caught, and the beam flickered when the light steadied. The uniforms hung still again, motionless, lifeless. But I didn't wait another second. I ran, my boots slamming against the concrete, heart threatening to burst out of my chest. That night, the power died. The hum of the generators ceased, leaving us buried in darkness so complete it was suffocating. I gripped my flashlight, but its beam was thin, weak, swallowed almost immediately by the shadows pressing against it. The silence didn't last long. Footsteps echoed through the bunker, slow, measured, bare. The sound wasn't above us, not near the gates, but deep within the halls themselves. Someone, or something, was walking the same ground we thought would shelter us. I followed the sound, against every instinct, because standing still felt worse. The halls stretched longer than I remembered, each turn unfamiliar. The footsteps grew louder, though I never saw anyone ahead. My light revealed only wet walls glistening as though they were bleeding water. The air grew heavy, damp with the stench of earth and mold. I stopped at a corridor intersection, the sound of the steps circling me now, shifting from one direction to the next. When I spun around, I caught a glimpse of something vanishing into the dark. Not a person, not exactly. A pale shape, impossibly thin, melting into the wall as though the concrete itself had swallowed it whole. I raised my light and saw only damp stone staring back at me. My pulse thundered as I turned toward the stairs, desperate to escape, when I realized something even worse. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence wasn't empty. The air carried a new sound, breathing, deep, ragged breathing, just behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth on the back of my neck. Time lost all meaning after we sealed ourselves in the bunker. Days and nights blurred into the same suffocating dark, broken only by the weak glow of flashlights and the dim hum of backup batteries. Some of the soldiers stopped speaking altogether, their eyes hollow, their movements sluggish. Others whispered to themselves, muttering words I couldn't understand. The air grew colder with each passing hour, and the walls seemed to close in, stretching and shrinking as though the bunker itself was alive. I started to feel as though we weren't underground at all, but trapped inside something that had swallowed us. I tried to keep track of where the corridors led, scratching marks on the walls with my knife, but it didn't help. Hallways stretched longer than they should, doors appeared where none had been before, and rooms repeated themselves in impossible ways. I would enter a supply room only to exit into the same hallway I had just left, My marks gone, the walls smooth again. Some soldiers vanished completely. One moment their bunks were occupied and the next they were empty. Their belongings neatly folded as if they had never been there at all. No one spoke about it. We simply moved through the darkness, each of us carrying the same silent fear. On one of my wanderings, I found a door I had never seen before. Its paint was peeling, the metal frame rusted with age. My hand trembled as I forced it open. Beyond it stretched a massive chamber, far larger than the bunker should have been able to hold. The ceiling was lost in shadow, the walls hidden behind curtains of vines that pulsed faintly as though veins carried blood through them. In the center of the chamber stood something impossible. The radio tower. The same one that rose above the outpost, but here it was rotting, broken, covered in roots. Its skeletal frame leaned to one side, cables dangling like torn tendons. It looked as though it had been buried underground for decades, forgotten by time. At the base of the tower, the ground was covered in footprints, hundreds of them, circling endlessly, pressed deep into the soil, as though a crowd had been walking there for years without rest. The sight of them stole the breath from my lungs. I stepped closer, drawn to the tower by a low hum that vibrated in my chest. It was a sound without source, a frequency too low to hear but impossible not to feel. My vision blurred, my body swaying forward. It felt alive, like a heart beating slowly beneath the earth. I forced myself to look away and scan the edges of the chamber. That's when I saw them. The figures, the same pale shapes from the forest, standing in silence against the walls. Their bodies were too thin, their limbs stretched unnaturally long, their faces pale and grinning far too wide. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light from my flashlight. They didn't move, not yet. They only watched. I stumbled backward, my boots sinking into one of the footprints. The soil was wet, soft, fresh, as though someone had just stepped there. My chest tightened as I realized the circle was still being walked, still being made. My light flickered, and for a moment I saw more of them, lining the chamber in every direction, all identical, all waiting. Panicked, I turned to flee and brushed my hand against the wall. My fingers struck cold metal, a plate bolted into the surface. Scratched into it were words that froze me in place. Unit 17, classified missing. Declared lost, 1983. My throat went dry as I read it again, unable to process what it meant. That was our unit number. Those were our identifiers. But the year carved into the metal was decades before we had ever set foot in this place. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking, the pale figures stepping forward now, their grins stretching wider, their feet falling into the same spiraling path of prints at the tower's base. My ears rang with a hum, my heart pounding in rhythm with it. The truth clawed its way into my mind like a parasite. We hadn't been deployed here to guard anything. We had been here all along, forgotten, trapped, a unit declared lost before we even knew we existed. The figures closed in, their bodies merging with the shadows, their grins the last thing visible before the light failed completely.